So welcome everyone. I recognize some faces from last week, so thank you so much for kind of being faithful to the series. So as I said last week, this series of philosophy public lectures is looking at this connection between science and the humanities in the public imagination. Now, every now and then, in the public imaginations, we hear this sort of crisis of the humanities coming, and kind of, and I was kind of thinking of whether think about the rise of the sciences might kind of give us some kind of food for thought of how humanities are faring and what's kind of the relationship between the science and the humanities. And today, kind of following from kind of thinking about how humanities can help us think about the future of AI, I want to think more generally about science and how the public in general can engage effectively with science. As a philosopher of science, I'm kind of thinking about science as a human activity, not that it's isolated sort of body of knowledge. So science is kind of informed by the interests of the people who do the science, by their values. So there is a need to kind of discuss those values and in some cases sort of defend them. And while I started kind of talking about kind of a crisis of the humanities, nowadays more often we hear talk about the crisis of trust in science. So I want to start us off with a sort of a question and have distinguished guests, so Kay Yeoman and Professor Kay Yeoman and Professor Stephen Ashworth, kind of to tell us their sort of impression and thoughts about this. Is there a crisis of trust in science? If there is, how can we build the trust back? What does trigger it? So do you think there is a crisis of trust in science?
Do you want to give it?
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming. Do I think there is a crisis in trust in science? I think scientists are trusted, but that is not evenly spread across scientists across different sectors. There is a public attitudinal survey which is done every 3 years. And this is one of the questions that is asked on that. And this has been going now for 15, 16 years. And the trust in scientists has actually gone up quite substantially over that length of time. The most recent one, which was done in 2019, showed that scientists who work in universities are the most trusted. But scientists who work in private companies, for example, pharmaceutical companies, are the least trusted. And the scientists who work for government and scientists who work for charitable organisations fall somewhere in the middle. So scientists themselves, as the people who are conducting the science, there is a relatively high level of trust, and that has been stable over a number of years. I think where we come to differences is how science is perceived to be regulated. And I think that this is where we have perhaps a breaking down of trust in the fact that the public don't necessarily feel that science is that well regulated. And they do feel that scientists have perhaps more, in their minds, perhaps scientists have more control over what they do than they actually really do. So I think that is probably what I would conclude to that particular question, but hand over to Stephen.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you took that first because you have all the facts and figures at your fingertips. Certainly, I think I would agree from my point of view that university scientists are very trusted, but again, it comes to this, the funding of science when you see specific cases of large companies funding science, and then the mistrust kicks in. Are the results, are we seeing all of the results? Are we seeing just the results that are beneficial to the funders? Which is where obviously government funding helps a lot. Trouble is with trust is it's very easy to lose and very hard to build back. And so if we do ever lose our trust in science and scientists, and we've seen over the last few years that there has been a growing growing voices at certain levels, certainly in politics, of don't trust the experts, be that scientists or perhaps other experts. And so I think that we are in danger, if we're not very careful, of having that trust taken away.
Yeah, one sort of kind of thing that came to mind when I was kind of thinking about this sort of question of trust in science has to do with the fact that now we see so much of the political debates polarized in the name of science. So it's like one political camp is saying, we can point to scientific studies showing that vaccines are safe, and the other camp is going to say, but we can point to kind of scientific studies showing that vaccines have all these sorts of risks. So when you think about the public hesitancy when it comes to vaccines, in the public spheres, you see appeals to scientific expertise on both sides. And similarly with kind of climate change. So you'll have the public political discourse saying, this group of scientists is kind of giving us this sort of view about climate change. Whereas, but there are these usually mavericks sort of scientists showing that climate change is not real, or that kind of at least the sort of changes are not as worrisome. And this sort of appeal, kind of blanket appeal to scientists, kind of defending both views, seems to, so there have been quite a couple of journals as well, scientific journals, pointing out that the fact that we kind of use science to justify kind of everything kind of contributes to a bit of loss of track who is to be trusted. Do you have any sort of thoughts about kind of this kind of use from the kind of politicians of science and the fact that they take over in a way?
Yeah, I think politics and science has gone hand in hand for an extremely long time. Really, ever since that science was a profession, there has been government influence over it and what is done. I think some of the examples that you are referring to there, some of that is a product of a requirement for balanced reporting, which organisations, journalism, media want to try and portray. And that requirement to have both a for and against can often bias what is essentially a large body of evidence, scientific evidence, towards one part of the argument and far less so than the other part. But because you are giving equal weight to a reporting issue, it kind of gives the impression that there are an equal balance of scientists for and against a particular issue, which is often actually not the case. And another good example of that is the MMR vaccine, where the huge body of evidence over MMR being safe, but equal reporting time was given to other dubious studies which suggested there were risks.
The other problem we have there is the soundbite science. Trying to explain the body of knowledge that we have on global warming, climate change, the changes in the anthropogenic changes to our atmosphere, that can't be done in a headline. It can't be done in a short article, not even a tweet. So it's very difficult then for the journalist, these are people trying to earn an honest living, but they need to sell their media, whatever media that happens to be. And so a sensational headline or a polarizing argument is wonderful for them, but it doesn't help necessarily the general populace to understand the nuances of the issues.
So, and when it comes to kind of responsibility you said earlier, Stephen, that, trust is kind of easy to lose and kind of, hard to kind of rebuild. It's like, is there kind of a matter of responsibility of kind of building this trust? So is it up to our politicians to help scientists? Is it up to scientists themselves? Like, can we think about kind of in the public sphere of how we can kind of build and kind of maintain this trust in science, even if we don't think the crisis is as dire as kind of some kind of titles would announce? But
not particularly, but
you go and then I'll go.
That's hard to rebuild trust. One has to try to be whiter than white, and that is going to be very difficult for anybody.
Yeah.
So I think I wouldn't know how we would necessarily go about it from a communicating science point of view to make sure that, because the problem is we're all human, and as scientists it's a profession, so we earn money doing it, and so we want to try and maintain our income just like anybody else. And one of the ways a research scientist will do that at university is to land grants.
Yep.
And so then you learn the system and you play the system.
Yep.
You do what is necessary to get the grant. And if this means that you have to put the most positive spin you can on something, then that's what you will do. If you need to put out a press release on recent results with the most positive spin on it possible, that's what you will do. But this is where we get the X disease will be cured in 10 years from 10 years ago, and it's still nowhere close to being cured because there's been a little breakthrough, someone's made a big splash. But this comes down to human nature. It comes down to the need to publicize these things in order to keep that process going. And if we see it in all sorts of ways that the systems that are put in place, we manipulate to our benefit.
Yeah.
And so those systems influence the behavior of the individuals using those systems.
I think for me, I think that coming at it at a slightly different angle, I think trust comes with respect, and it is about respecting different people's points of views. Your own perceptions about what science is, the benefit that it has to the society, the benefit it has to you as an individual is deeply ingrained, and it comes from a whole wealth of experiences from really early on, and it's really hard to change those perceptions around issues. And really all you can do as a science communicator is to understand where that perception has come from, and that the understanding that an individual has around an issue, and I don't really like the word understanding actually very much, their feelings towards something. You have to respect where that comes from. And it's not about changing people's minds, it's about coming towards a respectful position. And I think that that is where we need to strive towards. And this is where science communication as a profession of practical science communicators is coming to. It shouldn't be about the scientists saying, well, it's got to be this way, everybody's wrong and we're right. That's not the position we have to come from. We have to come from a much, much deeper social understanding.
Can I put you a bit on the spot kind of there, connecting something before I move to my next question? Because I thought it was really interesting when you pointed out earlier that there is a fine sort of line when it comes to kind of equal reporting, like two positions. So we kind of thought, okay, take vaccine hesitancy and the fact that we have scientific studies kind of showing quite conclusively the safety for the MMR vaccine, but then there are these sort of outliers, kind of maverick sort of studies kind of suggesting that there are these sorts of risks associated. And if we kind of give equal platform to those sort of positions being represented, you kind of distort the sort of message that is supported by scientific research. And I want to connect that, so that we have to be careful about that balance with what you said about this sort of general sort of dialogue that you're kind of pointing at. So it's not about changing, so you said it's not about just changing the minds of people and telling them you're wrong, it's kind of starting a dialogue with them. But take people who are vaccine hesitant, not those that deny, but how would that dialogue, kind of, how do you do that dialogue in a way in which you don't tell them you're wrong?
I think it's about being honest and open, and vaccines do have side effects. We know that they do. Everybody has been through the COVID era, and we know that vaccines have side effects. I think it's about the overall societal benefit that a vaccine program has, and vaccines have been probably the most single transformational human endeavour in terms of helping a population overcome disease. And it is, the evidence for that is extreme. But we as individuals have real problems about thinking of global benefit. It's a really hard concept to get into mind, and climate change falls into this, because you kind of feel that what impact can I have as an individual in this? And you end up having your own individual feelings and views about things. And I don't think we should be in the business of trying to persuade people. I just think it's about talking to people about protection, friends, family. But if somebody is really that hesitant about having it, I wouldn't be saying, you must do something. I mean, I think it would be we have actually as a nation been down the road of compulsory vaccination with the smallpox vaccine, and that didn't go down very well. This was way back when the smallpox vaccine was first developed. So, and that is the only time we've had compulsory vaccination in this country, whereas other countries do have compulsory vaccination. And in the United States, for example, you can't access a public education unless you have got a proven vaccine track record. So different countries deal with things differently and put different incentives on people to vaccinate. But it's a fascinating area, but it's only one of many issues which falls into this to this area of, what can I do as an individual to change something for the benefit of a much bigger population of people, or in fact a global population of people.
The other issue is kind of a bit related to the points, like out there, one argument is that if there is a kind of crisis of trust in science, one factor, and I know you disagree with this, but I'm just going to put it out there. One factor that makes that the case, so it's responsible for it, has to do with science literacy. And I know you don't particularly even like the phrase of science literacy, but it has to do with how we teach science, and it has to do with what people understand of science. So the argument would go, we don't have enough science literacy. People don't really understand kind of this. So the responsibility is on the public to understand more, rather than on the communicators, rather than on the politicians to use responsibly the sort of knowledge they have or they don't have. So I want to kind of us to think kind of a bit together about how we teach science, whether it's done in the best way possible, whether there are different ways of teaching science, not necessarily with an eye towards more science literacy, but just kind of a sense of doing better in whatever kind of way.
The concept of science literacy is very much one rooted in the 1960s. The fact that literacy about anything implies that there is a stock of knowledge that you can test, and that in itself becomes quite problematic. I think that media reporting like to kind of have standalone kind of shocking statements that says only X number of people know that the sun is a star, that kind of thing, and that kind of like taking knowledge out of context, I think, is quite dangerous. However, that whole concept of a deficit of knowledge did allow the national curriculum to be developed for England in the 1980s, which enabled children to have science through to what was then the O-levels, then obviously the GCSEs. So I think it was beneficial from the point of view of compulsory education. but I think it's highly problematic to suggest that people have a poor scientific literacy. That's not the way that I like to couch the science communication, nor the education work which I do with local schools. I think it's far more nuanced than that.
Well, this is an interesting question, because you look at young children, they are scientists. They're natural scientists. They go out, they poke, they prod, they smash, they investigate the world around them. And somehow along the way, we beat it out of them, this natural curiosity. And so when they come to university, they're dragging themselves in. They're no longer curious about the world around them. We give them all the facilities to do lots of wonderful stuff, and it just seems, don't get me wrong, it's not all university students, but it just seems there's a reluctance to engage with that. So something along the way could be different. It could be that we try to teach them too much science. That they're seeing the same things over and over again every year, and it's no longer fresh. Oh, I've done this before, and because I've done it before, I don't need to quite concentrate so much, and then you don't pick up that next layer of the onion, and that's how we beat it out of them, beat that enthusiasm out of them. So I think it does matter how we teach science, but we want, again, we don't want to think of a mass of humanity that are illiterate in science. What we would like to have is a population who can engage with a scientific argument, that can think critically. They don't need to know all the facts and figures, but just think critically about the facts and figures that are presented. And that is wonderful. As a science communicator, if you've got an audience that can engage with you at that level, then we can do wonders. But without that ability for critical thinking, then I think it's an uphill struggle as a science communicator. You don't want, it's been shown, throwing facts at people doesn't work.
No.
No. But engaging them to learn those facts and enabling them to shift position, to change their own minds, then that's what we need to be able to do.
Yeah, and framing it within something that people feel interested in. A lot of science communication work that I've done in the past has been rooted in the local community, rooted in what makes people interested in coming to the events. So if you frame it right, then people feel more likely that it has relevance for them, and they feel a sense of belonging to what it is that you're trying to do and trying to achieve. But Stephen's absolutely right. We don't start early enough, perhaps, in terms of that science enthusiasm, and we don't carry it through enough. Science is a joyous subject. It's highly practical. It's exciting. It's new. And you can discover things, every single day, and there's nothing like it. But we do tend to kind of beat the joy out, don't we, in terms of our education system.
Yeah, because as a philosopher, one sort of thing that puzzles me, and I see it very often in my students, they come to philosophy and they say they don't like science, or science is not for them, or don't get me started on the maths. So it's so, and then I kind of think how is that possible? I mean, philosophy for generation, it just came after science. It's it's not prior to science. It just comes along kind of the science. So it's kind of all about, so you see science as kind of being one way of understanding the world, and philosophy is trying to kind of capture that and see maybe there are some boundaries, some limits of what we can know. So I'm always very puzzled of students coming to university and saying that they have this very strong reaction to science. And it makes me wonder, is it because science is presented as this accumulation of facts and they feel they have to carry it on their shoulders, and there are way too many things, and then they want to break free? So you'll hear lots of humanities students, it's about discovering themselves, it's about kind of finding their place in the world, and it's is science seen as this sort of So do we have an issue with the public image of science as being a bank of facts, and that kind of is part of what goes into education presented? Is it kind of, do we have a textbook image of science as being a collection of facts rather than sort of activity that's kind of rooted in interests and so on? Do you think, like, from your...
Yes, I think that there is a certain amount of that. Factual science is cheaper to teach than practical science. That's what it actually comes down to in many instances. There's not enough time during the day to really allow our school children to really explore research and what science can do, and it is much easier to impart factual information, get them to regurgitate information. There's very little criticality that goes on within that. It's about answering, to the test, to get the qualification, to get to the next stage, to get to the next qualification. And I think that loses people absolutely along the way. And I certainly see it as part of what I've done over the last 20 years is to actually sort of break that down and go into schools and show that there is a different side to that. That, yes, you do need to understand some factual information about science, but it's not the essence of it. Scientific recall and scientific facts, providing you can get to grips with the concepts. You forget facts. We did a piece of research not so long ago that showed that 3 months after the A-level, students had forgotten 80% of their A-level factual knowledge. And what was left was concepts. And you can look facts up again. Why are we so hung up on testing the minutiae? Because they say that's killing the joy.
Yeah. I mean, and now ChatGPT is going to give them all the facts, isn't it? So, I mean, they're out there, so they can just ask. So, but do you think these sort of new technological advancement might create possibility for more reform in education? So, you said that there is this efficiency of teaching in a certain way, but maybe we can take more advantage of technology and kind of, is there any space that you see for...
Well, there's loads of space for technology, but I'd just like to go back to your previous point, if I may. You said there's this strong reaction against science. But don't you think it's strange that you hear, even on the radio, oh, science isn't for me, maths isn't for me. You wouldn't dare to say to someone, oh, Shakespeare isn't for me. You're expected, as a scientist, to have some minimal knowledge of the cultural life, music, the arts. Yet, it's okay, we think it's okay, I don't personally think it's okay, but we accept the fact that someone will say, oh, maths, I can't do that. Never was any good at chemistry, yet the scientist in the room is meant to be able to discourse on the merits of Shakespeare and Dickens. So technology, yes, there's lots of room for technology, but the problem is we need to know the principles, and certainly where the sorts of subjects I come from, chemistry and physics, piece of string and a stone on the end, you can learn lots of physics. You don't need the technology. Yes, technology gives you opportunities. It gives you opportunities for automation. It gives you opportunities to collect lots of data very quickly. But without understanding the basics, principles, without understanding the concepts, then you might as well not have the technology.
I'm going to pick on that because I think it's kind of not necessarily polarizing, but it's kind of an interesting fact that you kind of point out that there are different expectations that when it comes to kind of general culture. We think that things from the humanities, from the arts, English, history, how many wives, King, who was the one with the lot of wives? Had. So this is kind of part of the general knowledge. Is it, and again, some people have pointed out that that has to do something with we think that we have to protect this, we have to be more conservative with respect to these values. Science is continuously evolving, so maybe again there is a split. I mean, I'm trying to bring in the series humanities and science together, but maybe there is a bit of a sort of split in terms of public image. Does it have to do with the fact, oh, science is continuously changing, so you know, we gather the facts, we build this bank, but the general knowledge, we have to kind of protect this, is what makes us what we are. So do you think anything in kind of, there is something a bit about the conservative element, kind of when it comes to our culture, that makes us have certain demands of scientists?
But aren't arts and humanities always changing?
That's, I mean, Snow in kind of a long time ago thought they'd never, so we kind of keep reinventing and kind of circling around the same themes. And philosophers sometimes are happy with that image. They kind of think there is room for growth and for a different type of progress around concepts. But of course, I mean, you can make that sort of claim that they are changing, so that's not the paradigm. But
and where would arts and the humanities be without the sciences? You go to the theatre, you're looking at the magic of lighting, construction, that you've got engineering and you've got science. You look at the Angel of the North. Someone didn't build that with their own hands. That's an engineering marvel, but it's a piece of artwork. You can't draw this artificial distinction between one and the other. We want to read a book. How do we read books? It's the science of paper making, printing. They're always coming together.
Yeah, I think that decoupling of the arts and the sciences very much happened in the 19th century, when science became a thing. The term scientist was coined, and science as a profession began to emerge. And I think when that happened, you got this separation which occurred then between the creative arts and sciences. And science is incredibly creative. I don't think that that's necessarily thought about, perhaps, as being a creative subject, but it is. You have to be incredibly creative as a scientist. And a lot of scientists are incredibly good artists, and a lot of artists have great appreciation of science. But really, prior to the mid-19th century, we had natural philosophy, and sciences was part of natural philosophy. And so for all of those many centuries before, so our separation is of very recent origin.
And don't you think that came when it began to be the case that no one person could know everything about the scientific world, if nothing else? Because there was a time when one could keep up with all the journals that were published. But now it's just impossible. It's hard enough to find the time to even search for something that you're interested in, let alone regularly read all the journals that are possibly published.
So there is this side of sort of continuous specialization in science. So you become more specialized because we discover the problems are more complex than you initially thought, and we kind of come up with new questions, and we're going to have experts on kind of so that's one side of it. And the other side is how you patch this together and kind of through scientific collaboration. So so my last sort of question that I want to invite you is kind of reflecting a bit about on the future of science and how science might change. I mean, in an ideal world. So if you are to think as kind of practicing scientists and as people who communicate about science, what sort of vision for science would you have? Like a science that, one, takes into account that, we don't just go back to natural philosophy, no matter how much some people would wish, but a way forward that kind of brings some of the things we think were good maybe in the past, some of the things that we think are kind of. Any vision of the future of science?
I think there's far more public participation in science than there ever has been before, even when we had natural philosophy and privately funded endeavour. And that's through citizen science programmes. There are some highly successful citizen science programmes which the public can get involved in. There are very few of those, however, where the public set the agenda. And I think that, again, that's an interesting thing, that a lot of citizen science projects are very much controlled and set by the scientists themselves. There are some really good examples, particularly in Europe, around public agenda setting in these types of projects. And I think that that is perhaps something which is becoming more and more accessible. There's a whole kind of movement in the United States around science punk. So, you know, your homegrown scientist working in their garage, creating a polymerase chain reaction machine or using water baths and amplifying DNA. And that sort of thing, you know, was something, again, which harkens back to the idea of what was done in the 18th century in particular, where people would do their science and research at home. So we're coming a little bit full circle, I think, in some of that kind of DIY science. And I bring some of those concepts into the work that I do with school children. I run what I consider to be bona fide research, i.e. we are trying to find something new, not necessarily finding out something that we already know. And that's always really exciting, that opportunity that young people can have to really take part in a research endeavour is where I think we need to go in terms of the future of science.
Well, it turns out that we tend to think of science in these monolithic bricks. There's physics, there's chemistry, there's astronomy, but where the really exciting, interesting stuff is at the boundaries. And at the boundaries, you have to learn to talk to other people. You might have a physicist talking to a computer scientist, talking to a biologist about how leaves form and how we might model gene expression. And these are going to become the hotbeds of discovery, I think, in the future, as the very interdisciplinary teams who can talk to one another. So we mustn't have our scientists trained. We must have well-trained scientists, but then they shouldn't be in one silo. They need to be able to talk the language of another science. And you might not believe this if you have no experience at that level of science, but it's sometimes you need to get the arbiter in, because one scientist says something and the other scientist just doesn't understand because it's not in the right jargon or it's not using quite the right words. And so sometimes having a third party in there to translate is very, very efficient. And so if we could produce well-rounded scientists that could do that themselves, then they're well equipped to work in interdisciplinary teams. But the scientists we train don't just go off and work in science, the business of science. So they go off into the world and make their mark in all sorts of places. And one of the things that they will benefit from is that ability to think critically about anything that they are engaging in.
So what I hear, if I'm going to kind of connect them, is like not different models, but different aspects of kind of more democratic sort of science. So a science that kind of welcomes much more openly kind of an agenda that's shaped not only by people who are within kind of research institutions, but maybe kind of, you know, collaborators in kind of the civic space, but also kind of collaboration. So much more extensive maybe than they are or kind of continue to be in the sort of interdisciplinary teams, both having challenges, because, you know, I assume, just to reflect on the challenge, I assume when it comes to the public determining the agenda, what have you, I mean, in the project you looked, what's the resistance? Is there any resistance, kind of?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that given the opportunity to be able to set the agenda, the public comes up with extremely interesting ideas about the direction that certain pieces of research should take. And that kind of dialogue approach, I think, is something that we need to do more of. We do some of, but could do a lot more of. I think the problem with that is that, and there is always a problem to many of these things, is that the people who want to engage with that are usually quite self-selecting. Yeah. And it isn't necessarily particularly inclusive. And so I think that more needs to be done to bring science and those sorts of activities to all populations and all people, and just not those people who, who can access it because they have a computer and because they have the time and money to be able to take part in a citizen science project.
And like Stephen, you mentioned that, I mean, one challenge, kind of making it democratic in the sense of having interdisciplinary and kind of different voices, one, this sort of translation, because even if kind of science is not this sort of monoliths of kind of, physics different from chemistry and so on, via education, you do get a sort of a training to speak like a physicist or kind of think like a physicist. You kind of hear those sorts of, but when it comes to the translation effort, I mean, it's something that you see needs to be built in the kind of education of the scientists throughout, or is this something we can kind of patch and kind of, which expert should we kind of bring into the translation, or do you think?
Well, the thing is, at that level, you need well-qualified, trained scientists in some field or other. So it's the sort of thing that one would be able to do with interdisciplinary projects at a later stage. You get the grounding in first with the concepts and the knowledge that they need to operate at that level, and then expose them to people they have to try to communicate with and see how successful it is.
Thank you so much, both. I want to invite everyone to kind of participate to the conversation next. So any sorts of questions about kind of the points we touched, maybe you have your favorite sort of examples kind of coming from science and science, your favorite headline that you want demystified today by the experts. So welcome questions. I think our kind of, our helpers are there with the mic, so we'll take questions. Yep. They're in the back, Emily. At the back.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Jonathan Smith. I'm interested in a certain area where philosophy certainly, and the science of psychiatry and the study of psychology come together. And the last 12 years or so, these three areas have come together and they have joint publications. And the role of philosophy seems to have in some sense, enabled connections to be made in these three separate studies. And so but probably 15 years ago, this was not the case. They were quite separate, really. And it's interesting to see, where it might lead, whether philosophy will be dissolved and the sciences will take over, or inherently there is some philosophy in it because it's to do with human belief, and that's a rather peculiar subject.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take as a philosopher in residence. So I think philosophy for some time, usually I like to put 50 years on it into the mix, just for a number, has had a bit of a resistance, kind of been very defensive about its boundaries. So that has, like for better or worse, kind of not really encouraged interdisciplinary relations. And I think more and more philosophers, not out of ignorance, it's a bit of a human instinct. You want to, as kind of Stephen was saying, you want to protect the job, your vocation, the thing you think makes you special and kind of gives you a contribution to it. And I think what we see now with this sort of collaborative projects with psychiatrists, psychologists on questions about human behavior, about diseases, mental health, and things like that, is kind of philosophers admitting that they will lose actually their territory if they don't participate to this sort of conversation. So for a very long time, philosophers wanted to stand their ground that we deal with the conceptual, not with the empirical. in a way, forgetting the whole history of natural philosophy that always had to deal with both. Philosophy comes as a sort of commentary. So I think there is a fruitful future for kind of philosophy contributing. I think more philosophers kind of dare not to be afraid that, oh, this means that psychology will take over or kind of psychiatrists will take over. Because I think the contributions of philosophers are quite distinctive. I think where they are appreciated is where philosophers come and say, but what do you mean by a disease? Why do we need to kind of conceptualize disease in this way? Why do we kind of take this to be kind of the main explanation? So there's kind of, it's always kind of pushing these sort of critical boundaries of the explanations and kind of frameworks provided. So I don't think they will be out of a job. I don't know about, like in the public sphere. I'm not talking about universities. We don't know what's going to happen. But in the public sphere, I think there's going to be room for philosophers to make contributions to interdisciplinary projects and to advance our understanding of lots of issues, especially at that intersection of those fields, yeah.
I think that was a question there.
I was interested in the discussion about the gap or not between science and humanities. And I found myself asking the question, supposing we took the word science out of that notice and put the word arts in it. And in fact, there's a similar problem. Down the road, we've got creative writing producing something called literary fiction, which is, for an awful lot of people, another world. They never look at it. Occasionally in Norwich, we have the opera, which is a complete no-no. Opera is the kind of cultural equivalent to maths for some people. And so, I mean, I think there's always a problem of communication. But the thing that struck me was that science is made by people, but it's actually made by people who are trying not to be people. Objectivity is the key thing in science. The founding motto of the Royal Society was not on my word. You had to prove it, you had to have data, you have to demonstrate it. Engagement with science, therefore, is quite different with engagement with the arts and humanities, which needs another part of you. That isn't to deny that science is creative, and I think the creativity in science is exactly the same as the nature of creativity in the arts, certainly in things like fiction, because basically to generate a hypothesis, you have to imagine possible worlds. And that seems to me what happens in the arts. But I do think there is a distinction that has to be made. And we can't deny that there is a problem of gross dishonesty in science. People publish lies. I was interested in the mention of psychiatry. You know, there's what's called psychology. There's what's called the great reproducibility crisis, where nobody can reproduce other people's results. So there are actually grounds for distrust. And, you know, we've seen it in the tobacco industry, we've seen it in the oil industry. We know that they knew about global warming a long time ago and just kept quiet about it. So there is reason for distrust. I came across a wonderful quote. You asked for quotes and things to say. When I first became a professor, it's by Wilhelm Friedrich of Prussia, who said, "Whores, dancers, and professors may be easily got for money."
Oh, that's so fascinating. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the things that we try and teach our undergraduate students is not to believe what they read in published papers, that they need to be critical about what they read. And I think there is that assumption, is because it's down in print and because it's had a peer review process, that it must be true. And of course, we know that it may not be true. It might be falsified, or it might have, or there may be incorrect conclusions drawn from the data which has been published. So, and I think that this kind of comes back to some of your idea about that tension, a group of scientists for or a group of scientists against, is because science strives for the truth, but you always have to accept that there's no correct. There's no such thing as really a correct answer. Certainly in my biological sciences, although I take the point that maybe physics and chemistry might
Well,
be a little
there
bit
is
more.
your truth and there is my truth, and they may be equally valid. But the one thing that I'd like to pick up on from that is the reproducibility, because a lot of science that's published has used specialized equipment, has used put in lots of time and effort, and that peer review is just someone reading the paper and saying, yes, this seems to be a solid piece of work. It's not them going into the lab and making sure that all the results are right. Mm-hmm. So we hear that, oh, this has been published in some peer-reviewed journal somewhere. Yeah, that means a couple of overworked scientists have spent their Sunday afternoon reading this paper and writing a review saying, yes, it seems reasonable, I haven't seen the results published somewhere else. All of the conclusions that they make are backed by the data, and that's what peer review means. And it's done out of the goodness of our hearts as well. So it's not as if a journal actually makes any monetary reimbursement for the time spent doing this. And so you might find that you scratch the peer review process too much and you'll find it's quite weak.
But I want to kind of link your question and Stephen's comments to the initial question about trust. I mean, trust is not kind of a relationship just between the public and the scientists. It's also between scientists. So when a scientist is kind of reviewing a paper, you know, good faith, saying, you presented this data and said you use this methodology. I'm using my best knowledge to kind of assess this. It's also, so this assessment is done against kind of a background of trust in the other scientists. But scientists are people, even if some of the principle, as you kind of suggested, like objectivity seems to be superhuman. But they are people, so, and people do mistakes, and sometimes they have bad intentions. And it's not kind of to blame the whole scientific community if some of these bad intentions got unnoticed. Because kind of the peer review process is also sort of constructed on trust. I trust kind of this sort of findings have been achieved via the methods you say in the method sections have been used, and so on. I mean, when it comes to the social sciences, most of the studies that cannot be reproduced have to do with social psychology. Those are very hard studies to do for so many different reasons. And many people have pushed back concerning, like, about how big this crisis really is. Philosophers in particular pointing out, what do you mean by reproducibility? Like, do you need exact reproducibility so that kind of the findings that we kind of present have some validity? So, and then it kind of comes to this sort of idea that Stephen pointed, like, scientists are not monoliths and they might differ on their standards. So what kind of social psychology considers a standard for a valid test will be different from a chemist's sort of standard for a valid test. And maybe we should accept that of science. I don't know. I'm just kind of, if I'm to think, like, why would we want to have physics? I don't know. What would be the strongest? Would it be particle physics or kind of cosmology, which is kind of the...
Particle physics is a lot of statistics, and cosmology is big numbers, which you can't really... So big numbers with big uncertainties. So if of those two, I would go for particle physics. Yeah. So even the sort of kings of sort of science that we usually think physics, and then you get scientists saying these about their science. Yeah, but you know, lots of statistics and kind of big numbers, lots of uncertainties. But they are taken to be those who provide the standards for validity, and kind of think, okay, so you know, maybe we should have this dialogue about, you know, what are the standards for science, how much we understand about the bigger process rather than. So I think there's like very fruitful conversations that are suggested sort of by your remarks that kind of scientists and philosophers can kind of contribute to. Question in the book?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, I want to say thank you very much, because very interesting. The comment about trust, so this isn't a question, it's really that trust is gained by going up the stairs, but it's lost by coming down an elevator. Yeah. I think that's quite a common description of various things, actually. The bit I wanted to talk about particularly came from your discussion about vaccines, and also an explanation in terms of the communication of science in terms of probabilities, and the actual, the general population's understanding of probability, and how little probabilistic outcomes are expressed in terms of some of these scientific findings that people talk about, and also that in terms of this may be the probabilistic outcome of something as far as we know it. And it's not put into a context of, or certainly it comes across as a definitive, whereas actually the majority of the time it is only probabilistic. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think it is well known within the science communication theory of it that understanding of risk and probability is something which we don't do well, I think, as a population in general, and why that is probably there must be some kind of psychological root to that, in the fact that we will be risk adverse in some things but take huge risks in other areas. So that there has to be something around our culture and environment that makes that what it is. I think that, for example, going back to the 1980s, 1990s with the risks around BSE, so the mad cow disease, and the risk of eating beef, and then also the risk of eating genetically modified foods, all of that is perceived as being risky. But at the same time, we are quite happy to take risky outcomes on an individual level. People smoke, people don't eat healthily. But those are much higher risks than the risk of contracting variant CJD from BSE, for example. So, it's a really interesting area, and I don't have the answers to it. And I think that it does lie in psychology and social construct.
There are a couple of things here. One is that we are known not to be good at judging probabilities anyway. Plus the fact that a lot of probabilities that you hear reported are slightly misleading. So you hear a report on the radio taking this intervention, this medicine, doing some exercise can cut your risk by 50%. So does that mean it's changed from 2 in a million to 1 in a million, which isn't a very big change in risk? Or has it changed from 1 in 20, what would it be, 10 in 20 to 5 in 20? The risk there it's a huge difference, but you don't know. And I think that's where the communication of things like risk could be done a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, self-advertisement. We're doing in philosophy, like sort of philosophy of probabilities, which scares most of philosophy students. It's like, why? And then it's like, because we are kind of trying to understand why we are so bad at dealing and understanding with probabilities. And kind of part of it, there is a sort of reluctance kind of to deal with probabilities, because kind of probabilities are sort of mathematical. I'm not going to get it. So, it's just like, I'm not going to engage with them. But as you point out, it's very important, one, because most, if not all, of our scientific knowledge is probabilistic in nature. We have to allow for uncertainty. It has to do with the character of science, the fact that we strive to discover the truth, but we know we are not there yet. And we also know, if we are to believe some philosophers and psychologists, we might have limits to what we can know. So, all this sort of kind of a specter of uncertainty is there, so we have to deal with probabilities. But at the same time, I find in our education, we don't want to kind of tackle this problem. We don't want to kind of make people face, it's a probabilistic knowledge. People feel safe when they know we have certain knowledge, certain or it's fiction, so we don't care whether it's certain or not. But it's an issue that I kind of see in education, and I don't think only kind of science education is responsible. Humanities kind of are responsible for kind of educating more and more people about there's uncertainty, we have to deal with it, we have to understand it. Maybe we're not going to all become kind of mathematicians to understand probability, but we should be prepared not to be tricked by all these kind of numbers they are thrown at us. I always make these jokes with the students. So there's a chance of 67% that you'll get a first in my module. That number is meaningless. But of course, we see those meaningless numbers being thrown at us in the media quite a lot. Kind of, very often, I don't know about you, when you read communications around COVID and you kind of see some kind of percentage, and you try to dig it up. Like sometimes there is no thread, you cannot. So it's a made up number. But we more and more hang on to those numbers. So I think it's kind of quite important for us to demystify those numbers. Like when they mean something, what do they mean and how to deal with them? And when they don't, just call them out. It's like no need for numbers all the time on our uncertainty, because sometimes it's very hard to get kind of this road from a scientific result to a particular kind of, number of place to uncertainty or to risk. In some cases we can do it, but in others don't. So I think it's kind of an important sort of thing to flag over and over again.
And you have to remember that exactly 92% of all statistics are made up on the spot.
Yeah, there's a question in the back. Emily?
Thank you. My name's Chris Price, and unusually for me, I don't find myself vehemently disagreeing with any point that's been made. But just a couple of reflections. I mean, we started off, I think, with the thing about weighing evidence and the rather dubious practice of impartial reporting or balanced reporting, and how if we knew that 95% of scientists believed one thing and only 5% believed the other, that would help people understand. But I think there's a warning with that as well. I don't know when I first heard it. I know when I first said it in a debate sort of in university, and I pretend sometimes that I might have made it up, but it was that there's nothing as dangerous as when experts agree. And, I've found that through life, that's been quite an interesting thing to reflect on occasionally. And I think one of the consequences is that so-called facts become a bit solidified, a bit petrified, and nobody's able to question them. And I think it can therefore set us back quite a long time before someone has the nerve to go up against the established view and say, actually, what you've been teaching for the last 100 years is manifestly wrong, and here's the evidence, and all of you were actually wrong. Maybe somebody raised a point at the time and you crushed their view, but now there's no doubt that you were wrong. So I think that's something that I always hold in my mind. Be very careful when experts agree. I think that the other things I very much are with you on are how do we teach critical appraisal skills? Because I think whatever discipline you're in, you need that. You need to be able to question, where's this coming from? How's it been put together in all the ways that you've very eloquently described? And whilst in some ways there's a mathematical base to it, I don't think that means it's impossible for it to be a discipline that's taught to everyone in school. I mean, there's a lot of young boys I know who've got no interest at all in mathematics, so they'll say, but they are very smart when it comes to weighing up things, say, around football, which they are interested in, and they very quickly can understand the difference between the result in a one-off match, the chances of Leicester City winning the Premier League, and so on. So they have inbuilt quite a good idea of these things, and I think if we I mean, not to denigrate teachers in any way, I'm sure they're all brilliant at what they do and much better than I would be. But I think there are ways in which you can reach different audiences, and you kind of introduce mathematical concepts almost by stealth. They don't realise they've done it. So yeah, I think those were the main points. And the third one, I very much agree with you about blurring the boundaries between the different things. I mean, many years ago, I considered myself quite bright, but I was very naive. I went into medicine thinking it was a sort of factual-based discipline, and it took me quite a long part of my career to work out that it was nothing of the sort, and that you needed a whole range of other skills. And you know, even today, when something like climate change, even though I think most people now accept the scientific evidence, even if it's taken a few bad winters and summers of weather to really bring it home, that there is a thing called climate change, and the reasons for it are fairly evident. It doesn't mean it's changing anything about what we do. So science doesn't exist in a vacuum. You need all these other disciplines and all these other skills for it to have its full impact.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. A really interesting reflection. There is a social science theory that describes your first point, which is called the spiral of silence. So it can be very hard for people to speak out against a general body of opinion and thought. So yeah, I completely agree. And yes, science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Absolutely, it doesn't. We need all sorts of people's talents and thoughts and ideas to solve global problems. And it's only when people come together that we're going to actually achieve that.
Now, going back to your first point, this is how you look back at the history of science, and some of the biggest advances have come when that lone voice has spoken truth to power, as it were. You can see it in chemistry, you can see it in physics, astronomy, where there's been this scientific idea, and the new information is coming in all the time, and the idea has been tweaked and pushed to the very, very limits, and then at some point there's this new piece of evidence and someone says, well, it can't be like that. If we explain it this new way, then it fits all those facts that we knew before much better and accommodates the new information. So yes, this is one thing about science, that it will always be changing. Just over the time I've been working in university, what my colleagues have been teaching in the sort of synthetic chemistry branches has changed. They're learning, the undergraduates are learning stuff that didn't exist when I was an undergraduate. Of course, I teach physical chemistry, and that hasn't changed for hundreds of years. But maybe it will. You never know.
Yeah, just my 2 cents. So I'm quite a strong believer in the value of disagreement across all sorts of areas. I think the type of image of science that we seem to share, this sort of open-ended, committed to kind of discovering and improving, admitting it's fallible and so on, can be a model wider for society, and especially for politics, where kind of it feels that very often we are kind of pushed into, we have to agree with, the status quo, and kind of disagreement is something we have to overcome. It's not something we strive to as a source of some new ideas. And so I think, there is this sort of general, when you look at the practice of science, it's done by humans who disagree, and you get Galileo risking his life, and you get all these sorts of scientists just to kind of get this idea and to show how the evidence is bearing on it. There is a more general lesson for wider society from the practice of science, admitting that science is a human practice, even if it strives to these sort of ideals of objectivity in that. And kind of I was thinking about your point that how kind of teaching these sort of critical sort of thinking skills. I'm not a fan of those particular labels, because there are many and empty sort of things that can go under it. But I think it can be done, like my strong belief, it can be done only in this sort of interdisciplinary way. I don't think critical thinking is something that kind of belongs in philosophy or belongs in psychology because they know all the tricks about biases and heuristics, or kind of belongs to the scientists who are actually practicing it. Because I think sometimes having a bit of an outside view on the science and what they are doing will help to articulate what's exactly that sort of skill that you've done there. So I kind of believe that kind of the vision that like Stephen articulated about this sort of a future of science where maybe we kind of are not so stuck on these sort of boundaries and kind of belonging to this discipline or to this discipline, but kind of being, let me kind of learn something about medicine, the sort of the practical art of it, not the sort of, you know, basic research-based part of it. It's kind of interactive. Yes?
I was going to ask, so you know how medicine, there's medical ethics, and that's like a big part of it, whereas within the other pure sciences, you don't really talk about the ethical sides of it unless you come to like experiment and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, do you think it's linked to the progression of it in the future? Because in the past couple of years, we've all experienced how far medicine's progressed and had to progress because of the situations, but while being ethical in that situation, do you think, because you talked about being the science in the future, do these other sciences, like the pure sciences, need to incorporate an ethical aspect to it to be progressing to the way we need it to for people?
Okay, thank you. Should I
You go first.
Okay, I'll go. So when it comes to kind of ethics, I think there are like several questions when it comes to kind of ethics and kind of science. So one kind of maybe the boring sort of contribution has to do with kind of lots of work that's been done concerning research ethics. So philosophers have been, they kind of changed their minds like from the 60s, 70s, and now they more strongly believe that they can contribute to these sort of conversations with scientists in which we can help articulate what are the values that scientists are committed to, that science maybe as a practice is committed to, and how those values might clash in some instances with the values that society is holding. So talking about values for me is kind of part of the ethical discourse. And it should be done more, not only by philosophers, but by kind of everyone. So it should involve more kind of people kind of questioning. And it's not only a matter of funding and where the money goes. And it's kind of, sometimes you'll have scientists believing in truth with a capital T and kind of presenting a theory as being the truth because of so I think this kind of more general conversation about values is part of a broader ethical dialogue that's very important for one, us to correct the image of science a bit. So having, you know, oh, this kind of ivory tower is done and is giving us fact or the truth. And also correcting a bit this sort of idea that if we allow more of ethics, more of discourse of values, we make science too much like arts. You know, science is not going to be about objectivity, because there's been that worry expressed. You know, if we kind of admit that science is done by humans with interests, with values, and those values clash, then we kind of chip away at the distinctive contribution of science, at the objectivity of science. And I think that move can be resisted. We don't need to do that. So I think there is a very wide space for kind of thinking about ethics in science in these terms of values. And kind of values of scientists, values of the wider society, and kind of transactions between them.
I think it's in my own discipline in biological sciences, we do try and touch on values and ethics, but that's not systemic through the whole of the degree program, I would say. That you can do a biology and society module, for example, where we will teach ethical principles and we will discuss ethical scenarios. I think what we don't do very well, I don't think within the science curriculum, certainly in the biological sciences, if we've got it, is having that as something which is an overarching philosophy. And I think that when it comes to research, ethics can feel a little bit like a tick box exercise that you have to do. And in order to do certain bits of research, you have to go through ethical approval, and that's absolutely correct. But I don't necessarily think that there's an awful lot of deep thinking and engagement with ideas of philosophy and values that then go into creating those documents which you need to submit in order to then be able to do your experiment.
The other end of this is, of course, the use to which discoveries, inventions that come out of science are put.
Yeah.
And I was musing while the others were answering on how, as a scientist, one might think, I've discovered this, I've developed it, it's going to benefit humankind. So I might be the person who managed to fix nitrogen from the air, start the green revolution by making loads of fertilizer, but actually it was primarily used as, initially anyway, as a source of explosives. So where does that lie ethically? I could have, in that situation, said, I'm going to benefit mankind. But there's the other use of the technology, the invention, the product of that scientific research. And so how much does that reflect on the scientist who might have done this in good faith? I don't think actually that was done in good faith, but who might have done this in good faith, and then this is used for purposes they might not have imagined. They might not even have think. We do tend to be naive slightly as scientists in that sense.
Other question?
Hi, a couple of things really. One, I was very taken yesterday reading that Stephen Hawking, who wrote the Brief History of Time, said, I'm wrong. And in a week and a half's time, there's a new book coming out, which I think is going to be called The Origin of Time. So there's a scientist who is prepared to turn around and say, quite fundamentally, I was wrong, which is fantastic. The other thing I want to raise is the role of sort of popular science. You know, there's an awful lot of television programs about scientific matters, like David Attenborough's, Jimmy. I'm 77 years old. I started doing science experiments at school when I was like 7 years old. I stopped doing science experimenting lessons when I ultimately left secondary school. But I've ever since then, through whatever it is, 60 odd years, my science has come from popular books, popular science books, Richard Dawkins, people like that. And so when it comes to education, you know, the whole population is not in this vacuum. You know, I mean, when I go to Morrison's, the New Scientist is on the shelf. You know, so it's accessible to all of us, or at least the concepts are accessible. We don't have to do the experiments. We don't have to be capable of the mathematics and that sort of thing. But so far as to say the ethics is concerned, we as a population do need to understand what is going on, and by and large that background of scientific entertainment that we're thrown all the time forms part of that. So I mean, I'm quite interested in what your notion, you know, get off the pedestal of being scientists and think of yourself as being entertainers. You know, what role does that have, or how effective is that role?
Yeah, really, really hugely effective. We have an effect called the David Attenborough effect in biology. Whenever there is a major David Attenborough series, we see applications to ecology and conservation courses go up. Whether there is a similar Brian Cox effect, I don't know in terms of physics, but it is a well-known phenomenon. And so we're really hoping that the fantastic new series on Wild Isles will give us a similar boost to our student numbers in ecology and conservation. Popular science is critical, but again, we have to consider agendas in the fact that that the programming, the scheduling, who is a presenter is problematic probably in itself. I think popular science has made stars of and celebrities of certain individuals, and I think they have their place. But I think that there is a multitude of other media out there as well, which is equally as important. Social media influencers who could have great sway over thoughts and views about certain subjects, and could equally encourage young people to think of science as a career.
Yeah, I agree. There are these effects, and certainly the Brian Coxes, David Attenboroughs of this world have been fantastic advocates and communicators. But science is a practical subject, and much as you can get a lot from watching a TV program, you can get a lot more from going outside and observing the wildlife for yourself, or mixing up some chemicals in the kitchen, which I suspect you have done once or twice over the years to produce a meal, which is also experimentation after a fashion. So all these things have their place, and we are exposed to science in all sorts of sneaky ways that we might not realize. And there is a concept knocking around called science capital, which reflects the influences that you have had over a lifetime. This might be that you've watched lots of programs, you've read New Scientist, that you've been to museums, these sorts of things, these intangible brushes with science will leave their mark, and the more the merrier.
I think as well, what's actually really interesting is, again, a piece of research we did a little while ago that showed that the most recognisable science figure was a cartoon character, which was Velma Dinkley from Scooby-Doo.
Okay, good. I didn't expect that. I can speak to kind of public philosophy more than kind of in popular philosophy writing, and I think when it comes to I concur there is an important social role that they play, but I don't think we get the correlation of people reading public philosophy and wanting to do a philosophy degree. They read this sort of popular philosophy books and they think they understood everything, so they don't need to do a philosophy degree. And what I think it's a kind of a danger with, and I have many people who I admire who write kind of public philosophy and they write popular philosophy books. But because of the commercial aspect of it, very often they go for easy formulas. The Stoics are gonna solve everything. All the life crises you're gonna have to deal with when it comes to climate change. The Stoics are the answers for you. Just suck it up and it's gonna be fine. And I think they kind of simplify a lot of the richness of philosophy. And it would be great if they would attract people to kind of think kind of philosophically. And I think in part they do. But we also kind of have to kind of consider the value. If we hold kind of scientists responsible to all these sort of ethical standards about funding, about their values and interests not being always the most ideal ones, I think we should hold popular writers, philosophers or otherwise to the same standards and view them with a critical eye. Yes, they do this important sort of job in society of communicating ideas, and sometimes brash way in a way kind of that's a bit like with kind of titles in journals, attract attention. But we shouldn't forget, and I think we kind of tend to be more, I'm thinking about Dawkins at this while saying this, but it's like much more lenient towards them. It's like, they have to simplify things. And we tend to hold the people that are kind of in research, kind of the scientists that do social psychology, to much higher standards than the people that do popular science writing when it comes to psychology in particular. And it's natural, it's a thing we do, it's kind of because we consume it for certain purposes. But I think this sort of, all these sorts of voices that we heard about the importance of trying to be critical all the time, we should kind of do that. I think they could definitely contribute even more to the public sort of understanding of science and of philosophy if we don't forget to be critical of those as well, just as we are critical with kind of researchers, with academics, even with the journalists, we tend to blame the journalists very often for kind of everything because they simplified and things. So I think this general attitude of being reflective and critical should be expanded, and then the individual contributions will kind of feed in. So that was kind of my cautionary message when it comes to I have an issue with popular philosophy, as you kind of say that. Any other?
Well, just one other thing. The interesting point you made was that Stephen Hawking had done a U-turn, and you're praising him for it. Were that a politician, you would be vilifying him.
Would that mean that we have to be a bit more lenient towards politicians?
But there's always a consensus, isn't there? And the consensus does change.
Yes, and I personally think, why can't a politician make a U-turn if they're shown the evidence and they've made a rational decision on the new evidence? Then why do they have to be pilloried for it? But that's just my personal opinion.
Yes.
One of the most striking strange divisions I've noticed in between disciplines is the division seemingly between the study of science and the study of the philosophy of science, and that there's sort of, you often find people, it seems to me at least, who know very well how to do the scientific method but have little understanding of why that is the scientific method and why that would be valued more so than doing things some other way. And so my question is, do you think that there would be a significant improvement in how sciences or scientific inquiry was carried out if there were a greater focus on teaching about the study of knowledge and how we know the study of being and the study of values within science courses, whether those are in school or at universities?
That's interesting. I rather enjoy reading about the philosophy of science. I may not understand it all, so I probably need to go on one of your courses. But I hesitate to say that it would make a huge difference in how well the science was carried out. Knowing how we know what we know is interesting in and of itself, I think personally, but from what little I do know and understand, I don't think that would influence the raw materials that I am trying to shape greatly. However, I think it's something that we could usefully introduce them to for future study at a more mature level.
I think it's really interesting because going back to the foundation of the Royal Society and their motto on the word of no one, that was really done on Francis Bacon's inductive reasoning. And those embedded steps of what we consider to be the scientific method is instilled as a way of working, not necessarily as a set of steps. Now, that set of steps that says you start off with an observation and you turn that into a hypothesis and you go round an iterative loop, that actually wasn't written down until the 1950s. And it was part of an exercise in trying to teach school children about the scientific method. As a scientist, and I had a long research career at the bench, I don't think I ever once wrote down the steps of the scientific method and said, my research is going to now follow this and this and this and this. It just doesn't happen like that. You do have an overarching aim, and what you're trying to do is to work objectively. You're trying to work within the parameters of having a control. You're trying to build randomization into your experiment, but you don't follow those steps that you see in textbooks.
And I mean, as a philosopher of science, again, in residence, I think we should, I mean, kind of not put, what's the English saying, the cart before the horse. So I think philosophy traditionally has come as, it's a meta-reflection on the practice, on the action and what it's done. So I think with Stephen, I would kind of agree that, if we want scientists to reflect on what is knowledge and how it's produced and how the mechanism, you need a certain level, so you need to build on something. They need to build on the practice. I would be all about try to be curious and kind of do this sort of practice. And sure, get to reflect on it. But very often, and you see that in many philosophers of science and many metaphysicians, you start reflecting about what science is, never ever touch not even a textbook of science. And they still, so there's definitely lots of things that philosophers can say about what science is without knowing anything about science. And I don't think that's the right way either. And I don't think that scientists in particular could benefit by being taught that sort of way of kind of thinking about knowledge. So I think it can be done in a much more interdisciplinary, much more kind of interactive sort of way in which you kind of build the philosophical reflection on the back of the experience and kind of on the back of the action of kind of thinking as a scientist or acting as a scientist. I think there is value to that, but I think if we kind of rush in kind of doing the theory of the knowledge or of the method or before having the practice, we might not actually kind of improve much. It might be just another type of abstract knowledge that will not kind of bring us the benefits that we think are there. So because what I want to see in my students is not so much them kind of being, acting all smart, we do understand probabilities, let us kind of go and teach the scientists. But I want to kind of make them see, one, kind of the elements of continuity between their science and their kind of philosophical thinking and so on, but also really wanting to kind of become curious about science. I just want them to reject the sort of very big split that sometimes they come, from schools, that there is a big distinction between kind of doing science and doing philosophy. So I think that can be done, but I think we should kind of think quite carefully when and how we should do it without teaching from the armchair. If there are no further questions, I would like to invite you to consider kind of joining us also for the last event of the series, which is we'll bring 3 philosophers thinking about imagination and creativity in science and in the arts, and what are kind of the differences, the commonalities. Hopefully, the last sort of event will kind of try to bring in kind of some of the themes and topics that were kind of covered in the others. Thank you so much to Stephen and to Kay for joining the conversation today, and all of you for kind of joining and for your comments and contributions and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.